He's opinionated. He's unapologetic. He's always real. He is Brett Mason. This is the Brett Mason Show.
And welcome into another edition of the Brett Mason Show. I'm glad to have you here. Thank you so much. Reminder that if you don't have the app, you can download it in the App Store. Makes it easy for you to listen to the show anytime you want. All you got to do is search for Brett Mason Show, BRETTMASON Show. And that's available for Android and iOS devices. And, of course, you can subscribe to the podcast. I know we're on Stitcher and, of course, iTunes. Everybody's got to be on iTunes. You want to subscribe there. YouTube, you can catch the show on YouTube. In all those instances, you just need to do a search for Brett Mason Show, and you'll find us. I thought I'd begin a series on modern men of liberty. For me, the voice crying in the wilderness was Ron Paul. I came to be interested and driven to learn more about freedom and liberty and the concepts of freedom and liberty and the Constitution and things like that. And around 2005 to 2006, it was an interesting point in my life. I had devoted my, I guess a majority of my professional life to radio, and a major majority of that segment of my life was devoted to one company. And during that period of time in my life, I worked, for the most part, for way too little pay. Towards the end of my career, I was making a decent salary. Of course, once you start making a decent salary, I think this probably is true for most I can't say most any, but for a lot of jobs and in places of employment, they start looking for ways to replace you because you're a cost. You become, rather than an asset, they start viewing you as a liability. Instead of viewing all the experience, the technique, the skill, the revenue you generate with your ability as an asset, they begin to see you as a liability, especially when you're in an industry like I was in, where they can manipulate things. And in my instance, they wound up, through some hocus pocus stuff, violating FCC regulations to own nearly every viable radio station in town. And if you own nearly every radio station in town, suddenly competing with other radio stations isn't a concern anymore. Thereby, you don't need highly experienced, highly talented, and highly paid guns on your staff. So, that being said, the station I worked for, they still do have some pretty talented people there, a couple anyway. But the way they got around it was those people are part-time. So, they're not paying anybody what they were paying me. I can promise you that. So Ron Paul was my point being is I started realizing that I needed to, one, be self-reliant. And anytime you start to be self-reliant to where you start looking at areas to where you don't have to depend on anybody, and by depending on anybody, and I certainly don't mean this in a derogatory term. If you're working for an employer and you're a hard worker and you work 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, whatever you're working, even less. I mean, if you're working 25, 30, whatever you can work, you're certainly self-reliant in the sense that, you're taking care of yourself, but you're not self-dependent. So there's a difference between self-reliance and self-dependence. So you're self-reliant. I mean, you're not asking anybody for a handout. You're doing the work, much like I was at that time. But you're not self-dependent. You're interdependent on your employer. And that can change in a moment's notice, and it can really screw you over. So if you become interested in being self-dependent, the theories of liberty and freedom suddenly become very, very important to you, because you begin to realize as you try to make this journey into independence what a stranglehold the government has on you in terms of starting businesses and insurance and Social Security and all these many other things. It really causes the floor to be high. And what I mean by that is the entry level. Depending on what you're going to do or what kind of job or business, career you want to create, or whatever product you want to begin to sell, what service you want to provide on your path to being independent, the floor becomes higher and higher to where only people with money can get in on it. If you're starting something, so you need to incorporate, you got to hire lawyers and you got to form an LLC and you've got to handle insurance issues and then suddenly health insurance becomes an issue. I mean, there's all these. Suddenly, you can't be a person with some money in a savings account and start that. So there's limitations. That being said, you can still be a self-starter in this country, and you can still start something on your own. You need to think about it, and you need to be crafty about it. So nevertheless, at that period of time, Ron Paul was probably the most outspoken, quote-unquote, libertarian. He captured my attention. I watched every video I could find on him. I read many of his writings, which the further you go into libertarianism, the further you go. It's just never ending, and you can drill right down to, it ranges from we just need to look, a little bit smaller government libertarianism all the way down to there should be no government and it should be just us out here taking care of ourselves. So when you run into libertarians, you will run into libertarians across the spectrum, ranging from one end of those degrees to the other. Nevertheless, Ron Paul was a Republican in Congress, and as such, he made libertarianism very approachable because he's obviously in the system. He is in the political system, and makes him more approachable. But he definitely had some pretty in-depth concepts, and so that's what got me started. That being said, it makes it sound like Ron Paul is going to be the first subject of my Modern Men and Liberty segment, but he's not. What I started doing was trying to research other modern men of liberty who stood up and fought for liberty and freedom. And the first guy that came up on my list actually found this from an interview that I saw with Penn Jillette, who's one of my heroes. He's, of course, is half of Penn and Teller. They've been magicians for decades and decades, and he's very outspoken libertarian, and I like his point of view. Generally speaking, I agree with almost everything Penn Jillette says. Nevertheless, I was watching a video of him at some point in time, and he mentioned how much that he missed Harry Browne, and I got into Harry Browne. And Harry Browne, he was a writer, he was a politician, he was an investment analyst, and became well respected in the libertarian community, and actually was the presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party in 96 and 2000. He wrote about, I think it was 12 books or so. Sold between 2 and 3 million copies of that. He served in the armed services, and he just was a very smart guy. And so if you come along later in the scheme, your opportunity to learn about somebody, learn about what they stood for, and learn from them to continue your advancement in the cause of liberty and the understanding of liberty and the educational aspect of understanding liberty is through speeches they made, quotes they made, videos, books, things like that. So what I thought I would do to introduce you, the audience of the Brett Mason Show, to Harry Browne, in case you're not familiar with him, would be to do a discussion of libertarianism through Harry Browne quotes, if that makes sense. So we'll take some of my favorite Harry Browne quotes as a launching point and use that to launch into a discussion of that particular aspect of libertarianism. I think that'll serve two roles. One, it will introduce us and acquaint us better with Harry Browne, who passed away in 2006, by the way, with Lou Gehrig's disease. So he's no longer with us. But so we'll explore libertarianism and the concepts of libertarianism and freedom and liberty through the quotes of Harry Browne. So we'll be able to learn and explore while being introduced to one of the modern men of liberty who, even though I didn't really know him because I came into this after him, I agree now with Penn Jillette in that I miss him. And I wish I had known more about him at the time. There's a couple of regrets I have in life, 2 or 3. One of them is that I did not start trying to start my own business earlier. I wish I had started that at age 18 and never gave up until I was successful. And I wish I would have understood the concepts of liberty and got into libertarianism and the understanding of the Constitution and the founding of our country earlier at a younger age. So quoting Harry Browne and discussing libertarianism, libertarians, this is a quote, libertarians understand a very simple fact of life. Government doesn't work. It can't deliver the mail on time. It doesn't keep our cities safe. It doesn't educate our children properly, end quote. Understanding these things is, interestingly enough, what turned a lot of people towards libertarianism when you start seeing failures of the government. I'll tell you what's maddening to me is we have a long history of government failure in areas like keeping our city safe, keeping, where we live safe, educating our children. They have a long history of failure of that. Long. It's not like it's just been happening in the last couple of years. It's been happening for decades and decades and decades. Yet we continue to try to raise more money, extort more money from private citizens to give them more money to try to do what they have not been able to do, which is just maddening to me. The Federal Department of Education is just a joke. I mean, imagine this. This is what happens, and I'm not sure people understand what happens. But if you're a state and you want to get money for education, because now we have the Federal Department of Education, the money is funneled to them in Washington, then is redispensed. The majority of it, a huge amount of it. So if you want to get that money, you have to agree to do things they tell you to do. It's kind of like the mobster. The mobster will provide you services, but it comes at a price. The mobster comes into your fish market on the corner of 8th and Elm and says, "Hey, buddy, I heard there's a lot of fires going around. A lot of people's windows getting smashed. A lot of the products getting stolen. We'll protect you for 10% a month." Well, they're the ones they're the ones causing the problem to start with. They're the ones smashing the windows, burning the places down and robbing them. But they're going to charge you to protect them. It's a racket. The government does the same thing. The government is the one poorly educating the children. The government is the one that has no clue on how to educate the children, how to keep people safe, or any of those things. But if you give them more money, other than they'll ensure that they can get it done. And the more money you give them, the less they do. So what happens as a state is to get that money, you agree to abide by their crappy standards and rules of educating children that don't work. And you take your state money and you send it up there to them. Well, look, it gets divided up. It costs a lot of money to run the Federal Department of Education. So all that money gets divided up. A bunch of it goes out. For every dollar you send them, you're going to get maybe 60 cents of that back. So you're sending out $1 of money that is raised from the citizens of your state to educate the children of your state. You're taking that $1, you're shipping it off to a bunch of morons, and they ship back 60 cents of it with a bunch of stupid rules and go, "Here, educate your children with the 60 cents on the $1 that you originally had using our stupid rules that don't work." It's maddening. It's a maddening process, and people keep repeating. And then during the next election cycle, we all look to the next politician to explain to us how they're going to educate our children better. Well, step number one is going to be more revenue. You can bet that right off the bat. Well, we need more revenue. You will see some Republicans talk about state things need to be handled on the local level. You will see the rarity, like Ron Paul in the last election and his son Rand Paul in this election, talk about eliminating the Department of Education federally. But for the most part, it's just we need to raise more money is mostly what all of them will say. A lot of people that find libertarianism find it through realizing things just like that. And suddenly it dawns on them, this is just really stupid what's going on here. Harry Browne quote number 2. The American way was for commerce, personal relationships, and religion to be voluntary. No one was forced to participate in something he didn't want, end quote. Amen, Brother Harry Browne. Think about how different that is now, today. Like, is that even closely resembling America today? Let's just look at commerce. How many things are you forced to buy now? You're forced to buy health insurance. You're forced to buy automobile insurance. Those are forced on you by the government, not by the private sector. I heard somebody make the argument that you were also forced to buy homeowners insurance. Well, that's different. You have a mortgage on your house, and a bank provided you, they gave you the money to buy the house with, but you haven't paid for it yet. You've only paid a little bit of what you promised to pay them. And if the house burns down, they're out. They just gave you money for nothing. The insurance means that if your house burns down, they get the money that they loaned you back. So that's much different than the government requiring you to buy some kind of insurance. The two things are not similar. I see this a lot. I see people confusing private concepts with government concepts all the time. And the two are completely different. You know, if I enter into a contract with you on a personal level, I can make you agree to anything that I need you to agree to for us to interact. And it's voluntary. You can choose whether to do it or not. And if not, you can go to another person and get a better deal. With the government, you don't have that option. If the government provides the service or provides the resource, and they're the only one that can provide it, then you are forced to abide by the rules. You don't have any options. You have no choices in that instance. So the next quote from Harry Browne, to me, is one of the most brilliant yet frustrating facts of where we are with the people, citizens of the United States today. Because make no mistake about it, we live in a country where the vast majority of people here are, at the very minimum, underinformed. But more likely just completely ignorant on the aspects of freedom, liberty, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They don't know anything about any of that. We can go back to 2 quotes ago where the government does a miserable job of educating our children. But they also choose what you get educated on. And let me tell you, in-depth understanding of the Constitution and your freedom as a United States citizen is not something they have a lot of interest in educating you well in. You know, the government does not want you having a very deep understanding of that, believe me. They would much prefer to have ignorant, dumbed-down citizens who don't really understand their rights, don't understand the rights we were intended to have and do have under the Constitution, that many of them have just been subverted. And if you have an ignorant populace, you can subvert their rights because they don't know any better. Quoting Harry Browne, quote, "The Constitution isn't written in Chinese, Swahili, or Sanskrit. It's in plain English. And that's what makes it so frustrating. There's nothing preventing anyone from reading the Constitution." And I like how they talk about how we need constitutional scholars to flesh out whether this is. The Constitution was written to be so the common everyman could understand it. Our founders were very meticulous about that. Our founders did not write a document that was so complicated that it takes legal scholars to understand what it means. The Constitution was written in terms that any average everyman could understand. There's nothing complicated about the Constitution. There just isn't. What it says, and what it means. I love how they try to conflagrate the right to bear arms and say that the Constitution somehow meant that only the military had a right to bear arms because it mentions militias, well-regulated militia. The military is something that is an arm of the government. The government doesn't need the Constitution to say that it's okay for its military to bear arms. That's just ridiculous. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And for anybody to believe that, you just really have to be stupid. You have to be a stupid person. You have to have a very low IQ. You probably could have co-starred in the movie Dumb and Dumberer. My mom and I were having a celebratory meal. It's interesting when she and I go to UAB for her treatments for her diagnosis of cancer. She's in remission, by the way. It was very good news. The last trip was good news. Typically, we will try to eat the healthiest, most vegan things we can find. Try to eat the best we can. But we were in a celebratory mood, and I was craving hash brown casserole from Cracker Barrel. God, was I craving it. So we went in there, and my mom loves to look around in there and see what she can find. And she found a frameable Constitution suitable for framing. My point is they're available everywhere. It's not hard to get your hands on a Constitution. Most obviously and simply, you just go online. You can just go online. If you're listening to this, you have the means to study the Constitution. If you're able to listen to this podcast, you are more than capable of studying the Constitution. Not only can you go read it for yourself, you can find numerous resources, many of them libertarian, liberty, freedom, unbiased based, to understand what it is you're reading in case you can't quite understand it yourself. So there's no excuse for not understanding your constitutionally protected freedoms. That doesn't mean that your freedom comes from the Constitution, which is a clear distinction that it's important to make. Your freedom and liberty comes from being born. They come from your Creator. But we have certain liberties and freedoms that are constitutionally protected. In other words, the Constitution spells them out specifically. Harry Browne quote, "Libertarians know that a free country has nothing to fear from anyone coming in or going out." Let me repeat that before I continue the quote. Libertarians know that a free country has nothing to fear from anyone coming in or going out, while a welfare state is scared to death of poor people coming in and rich people leaving. That really puts the immigration issue to rest, in my mind. I understand we have borders, and I understand why people are concerned. But if you listen to all the arguments that people make, none of them are based on freedom. They're based on anchor babies. They're based on people getting access to Social Security, to free health care, to free education. So the problem with immigration is that poor people can come in and take advantage of all the many goodies that are. Oh God, it's so simple. I'm sorry. It's just unbelievably simple. Poor people come in and they just take advantage of the handouts that our welfare state provides. The real problem is that we live in a welfare state, but rather than change the welfare state we live in, we would prefer to have a big uproar over illegal immigrants. Now, look, in the modern day discussion that Donald Trump has raised, where he brings up the fact that many of these illegal immigrants are robbers and murderers, that's going to be true of any population. I'm not condoning that by any means, but the problem isn't immigration. Immigration, you can't determine if somebody's a murderer when they come in. Can you look them over and go, oh, that guy looks like a murderer? No. Now, if it's somebody who has some kind of record, I mean, look, the law enforcement works way different down in Mexico than it works here. I mean, the odds of any viable records or anything are just much slimmer from down there. So, I mean, it's very likely that axe murderers and who God knows what other ilk coming in, that there would be no way to identify that. So, you know, if you're going to use that as a standard, then you don't let anybody in, because you can't determine anything about anybody. So we just don't ever let anybody in. We shut the border down and there's no people can come in ever. I'm sure the Native Americans wish they had that policy. I wish they'd been standing on the Gulf Coast, or not the Gulf Coast, but the coast. The Atlantic coast, and opened fire and repelled the invaders that eventually came over and took their country away from them. Now they live on reservations in Hobble. And people that make the argument that Native Americans have it good because they get to open casinos and stuff, go look at videos, go find documentaries on reservations in the United States of America and see how well these people are living. I can promise you they are not living well. Nevertheless, that's a whole other issue. Look, that's happened. It's in the past. We can't necessarily change that. The only way we could change that is to do something that would never happen, and that would be turn their country back over to them. But since it was widely divided and split up, because they actually lived under, for better or for worse, the tenets of what we should be living under, which is freedom. People, you claimed your own territory, you defended it yourself. There was no centralized government. That's why you had different tribes, you had different sects, you had, across the country. It was all split up. Everything was different. Nevertheless, that's a whole nother discussion. I'm not getting into that. Libertarians know that a free country has nothing to fear from anyone coming in or anyone going out, while a welfare state is scared to death of poor people coming in and rich people going out. End quote. One of the more brilliant things Harry Browne ever said. That may be my favorite quote from him because of the simplicity of it. Harry Browne quote, here we go. Communities don't think, don't believe, don't want, don't have needs, don't have interests, and don't make decisions. Only individuals have minds that generate desires and needs, and only individuals can make choices and decisions. Boy, is this something people need to understand. But the government manipulates this concept of communities to build coalitions to help them get more power. The gay community needs this. The black community needs this. The religious community needs this. The conservative community needs this. The Southern conservatives need this. The upper Eastern liberals community needs this. The handicapped community needs this. They divide you into communities, and so you're on a team. Look, one of the greatest things politicians ever did was create teams. The first teams, of course, were the Republican and Democratic teams. So you're instantly on a team, and you root for your team. And if you watch news on TV today, everything is broken down in terms of what team you're on. Republicans today tried to do this. Well, if you're a Democrat, I'm on Team Democrat. I'm instantly opposed to what the other team is doing. Instantly. It doesn't matter if it has merit. It doesn't matter if it advances freedom, if it advances my personal liberty and freedom and my ability to stand as a human being and succeed in this country. I'm instantly against it because the Republicans are doing it, and the vice versa is true. Today on Capitol Hill, Democrats introduced a law to do Really? The damn Democrats. And that's what you get from Republicans. The other team has done something horrible. I am on Team Republican. Rah, rah, rah. Boo, Team Democrat. Well, let me tell you, there's good ideas that come from both sides. But for the most part, it's just mostly horrible ideas that come from both sides. You absolutely probably most of the time should boo Democratic initiatives. And you should boo Republican initiatives. They're all designed to take away more of your freedom, more of your liberty, and more of your money. That's all they do. Break down any bill that's passed. Ask yourself, does it give me more freedom or less? Does it put more money in my pocket or take more money away? That's really what you should ask about every bill. Just every bill that's up, ask what the end result of the bill is. A, does it give me more freedom or less freedom? And does it give me more money in my pocket as a free individual or less money in my pocket as a free individual? And you will find that all those bills do two things: give you less freedom and less money. Harry Browne quote, "Since no one but you can know what's best for you, government control cannot make your life better." One of the most profound, simplest things that you could ever possibly understand. And they've determined that that's what government is now because, again, they can divide you up into teams and communities and pit you against each other and do power grabs for themselves. But government, they don't know what's best for you. And one of the most fascinating and interesting things about our Constitution and the concepts of freedom and liberty was envisioned by founding fathers is that everything was boiled down to the individual, not a group. Not a group of people, not a category of people, not a classification of people. Our freedoms and liberties in this country were designed to cater to a group of one. Me. I am supreme. I have supreme rule and domination over my life. I make the choices for my life. I make the decisions for my life. I live with the consequences for the decisions of my life. I and I alone. And in that capacity, I deserve the maximum amount of freedom and liberty to pursue those decisions, pursue those desires, pursue those goals. And in addition to that, in the interest of maximum freedom and liberty, I'm also free to live with the consequences of those decisions and those goals, those desires. And so the government was designed to provide maximum liberty to the individual. Individual liberty. So when you read about or hear about laws being passed to quote unquote make things better for a group of people, you can instantly know that this runs contrary to the founding of our country in every way possible. It runs contrary to the Constitution in every way possible. Our country was never designed to be that way, and that's why our country worked so well for so long. It doesn't work well anymore. And so the people that talk about how, and you see this from both sides. You see it from the liberal, from the Democrat. You see it from the quote-unquote conservative Republican, about how we need the government to make things better, to increase morality, to increase the way people act and treat others, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I love this last Harry Browne quote is because it puts that entire concept to bed. It boots that to the curb, and there's no point in even looking at things like that anymore. Quoting Harry Browne, only free people have an incentive to be virtuous. Only free people have an incentive to be virtuous. Only people who bear the consequences of their own acts will care about those consequences and try to learn from their mistakes. If I were to add anything to this quote, and God forbid I should try to improve upon anything Harry Browne said, but I would stick a word in there. Harry Browne said only people who bear the consequences of their own acts. I would change that, just knowing how things are dispensed today. I would change that to say only people who bear the maximum consequences of their own acts, because we're hedged against consequences in so many different ways. But I'll give you a perfect example of that, and it was the bailout. Look, government caused that. Let there be no mistake. The things that led up to the housing bust, the things that led up to the supposedly near complete decline of our economy, and the things that led up to us bailing out certain corporations, massive multi-gazillion dollar corporations, was because they weren't allowed the freedom to suffer the consequences of their mistakes. There was no consequences. Do you think those people are going to occupy? They talk about how we got to pass laws now. That's their big thing. Well, we need laws to rein in these corporations. You didn't need a law. There was no law needed. If you would have just let them suffer from the consequences of their actions, there would be no need for a law. Trust me, most of them would be out of business. And you're like, whoa, remember that too big to fail? Whoa, they're too big to fail. No, they're not. Nobody's too big to fail. You let them fail. You have a collapse. A restructuring happens. Somebody else smarter and wiser with their money comes in and buys that company up. They put it back on the right path. Sure, there's some people out of business, some multi-billionaires that suddenly aren't in control of this business that they ran into the ground anymore. But the thing continues. Make no doubt that it continues. This whole concept that if the government hadn't robbed you and I of money and given it to these companies, that they would have fallen away and went into oblivion. It's one of the biggest lies ever perpetrated on the American people. And there's been some big ones, but it's one of the biggest. No, they would have restructured. They may have gone into bankruptcy. They would have there's several things they would have done, but make no mistake, those companies would have survived, but they would have probably survived under different ownership. You can't take away the consequences. You can't take away the consequences. You just can't. And that applies to companies and it applies to people. Well, consequences suck. Believe me, I know. As I face the consequences of the way I've lived, I face the consequences of the way I've eaten my whole life. I face the consequences of the lifestyles I've chosen, and I guess gluttony would be a word for a lot of that. But we all have to face the consequences of our decisions, but we supposedly learn from them. There's an argument to be made some people will never learn. But let me tell you, if you want to allow the maximum amount of learning and getting better to happen, provide the maximum amount of freedom. So I hope today that you have gotten to know Harry Browne a little bit better today in the first of our series of Modern Men of Liberty. It could be women. Modern Men just has that nice alliteration to it. But I guess you could go Modern Women of Liberty and it would have the same thing. So I'm not opposed to featuring women in this series. But there's number one, Harry Browne. Go learn more about him. He has some great books on Amazon. Some are really, really cheap. You can get them on Kindle. And he could be one of the greatest educators of liberty that you've ever come into contact with. And I hope you enjoy the series. And thanks so much for listening to The Brett Mason Show. I really do appreciate it.
Download the free Android or iOS app. Search for The Brett Mason Show. You can subscribe to the podcast, download the free smartphone app, and find more ways to connect to the show at brett-mason.com/connect.